Imagine, if you will, stepping into a time machine and dialing the year back to 1900.
Great.
You open the door, step out, and you find yourself standing in a nation of just staggering, almost incomprehensible natural wealth. I mean, you are looking at a country sitting proudly, comfortably in the top 10 of the entire global GDP rankings.
Right. Right at the top of the world.
Exactly. The streets around you are lined with these magnificent, newly constructed European-style buildings. The agricultural exports from the vast fertile plains surrounding the capital, they are practically feeding the world.
Yeah. Aided by what was then the brand new technology of refrigerated shipping, which was a massive deal.
Huge deal. And because of that, European immigrants are just flooding into the ports by the hundreds of thousands. Because this place, globally, is universally considered the land of the future. It is the promised land for capital and ambition.
The optimism in that specific era was just palpable. I mean, investors in London and Paris were pouring money into their railway networks and ports, assuming, quite reasonably at the time, that they were building the next great global superpower.
Right. It was a society operating with supreme confidence.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now, get back in that time machine. We're going to a completely different location, and we're going to fast forward to the year 1992.
A very different picture.
A completely jarring reality. You open the door, and you are standing in a landlocked, resource-poor nation that has just been pulverized by a geopolitical earthquake.
The collapse of the Soviet Union.
Exactly. The centralized supply chains that kept the entire economy moving have just vanished overnight. The energy grid is dead. People are, and this is a real historical detail, people are literally cutting down the decorative trees in the capital city's public park.
Just to burn the wood to keep from freezing in the winter.
Yeah. To keep from freezing, the population is attempting to construct a modern state from the absolute freezing rubble of a fallen empire, all while dealing with a total regional blockade.
It is the definition of a systemic reset,
Yeah.
but under the most hostile conditions imaginable. Like
Yeah.
the formal economy essentially ceased to exist, right?
Right.
And mere physical survival became the primary metric of success for the average family, just making it to the next day.
So I want you to hold those two starting points in your mind. The gilded, wealthy powerhouse of 1900 and the desperate, freezing survivor of 1992. Now let's fast forward to today, to the world you and I actually live in right now.
Here comes the twist.
Yeah, here's the twist. The former global powerhouse is currently suffering from inflation rates that regularly blast past 100%. It is trapped in this relentless, exhausting cycle of political and economic instability.
Constantly renegotiating debt, constantly trying to put out social fires.
Exactly. Meanwhile, that desperate survivor from 1992, they have risen from the ashes with explosive, tech-driven economic growth. They're rapidly modernizing, catching up to the developed world, and honestly becoming a hub for digital innovation.
Which, presents us with one of the most counterintuitive developmental paradoxes in modern history.
It really does, because if you were a betting person...
Right. If you were looking at a ledger of natural resources and early capital accumulation back in the day, you would have put all your money on the First Nation. Every single time.
But the reveal here is that the fallen star, the former wealthy powerhouse with all the agricultural might, is Argentina. And the resilient survivor, climbing out of the 1992 rubble with a laptop in hand, is Armenia.
And throughout this entire deep dive today, we're going to use a third country as our baseline.
Right, our control group.
Exactly. Our control group of uninterrupted, predictable, maybe slightly boring, but undeniably beautiful prosperity, which is Australia.
So the big question, the thesis for our deep dive today is, why does economic growth lead to a dead end for some nations and a golden age for others? Like, why does one nation's immense natural wealth turn to dust, while another nation builds a thriving digital economy from literal rubble?
And the answer, as we're going to see by unpacking a massive trove of historical data today, is not about who has the most gold or wheat or oil beneath their soil.
No. It comes down to this invisible scaffolding that exists beneath the surface of the society. We are talking about a concept called institutional resilience.
Yeah, institutional resilience is the hidden machinery. It's the complex system of rules, norms, and legal frameworks that either translates raw human effort into enduring national wealth,
Or conversely, grinds that human effort into dust through friction and instability.
beautifully put. Yes.
So to figure out how this invisible scaffolding actually functions, we are diving into an incredibly expensive, roughly 15-page data analysis titled Crossing the Chasm. And this isn't just a quick survey. We are tracing the long-term cycle of national development from 1946 all the way to predictive models for 2025. We are looking for the elusive golden ratio of institutional stability.
We really want to understand how the invisible rules of the game dictate whether a country flies or falls over the span of generations.
Mm.
And the foundation of this entire analysis rests on a data convergence that is, frankly, awe-inspiring in its scope.
It's huge. The researchers didn't just look at GDP, right?
No, GDP is just a tiny piece. They synthesize massive data sets from the Quality of Government Institute, the World Bank's World Development Indicators, and the Varieties of Democracy Project, which is commonly known as VDEM.
Oh, VDEM, yeah. I've seen them cited a lot lately.
They're the gold standard for this kind of thing. So we're looking at over 3,000 individual indicators.
3,000, wow.
Yeah, categorized across four main dimensions: political stability, economic performance, human development, and governance quality.
3,000 indicators tracking three completely different nations over 80 years. I really want you, the listener, to grasp the temporal magnitude here. We aren't just looking at a snapshot of today's news cycle.
Right, it's not about what happened last week.
This data spans the entirety of the Cold War. It covers the dramatic collapse of the Soviet Union. It tracks the agonizing debt crises of Latin America, and it pushes all the way through the birth of the internet and the current global digital transformation.
It's the ultimate window into how political ecosystems dictate national destinies over the long cycle. Because, when you zoom out to a timeline of 80 years, the noise of daily politics fades away.
The day-to-day scandals just disappear on the chart.
Exactly, and the deep structural tectonic plates of a society become clearly visible. You stop seeing individual politicians and start seeing the underlying system itself.
Okay, let's look at those tectonic plates right now, because the first major concept we need to explore in the source material is regime stability. Basically, how deeply rooted the actual government structure is.
Yeah, and the researchers rely on something called the Polity 2 index for this.
I've actually heard this referenced in political science before, but how does it actually assign a number to something as incredibly complex as a national government? Like, how do you put a number on democracy?
Well, the Polity 2 index is fascinating because it doesn't just ask the basic question, is there an election?
Right, because autocracies hold elections all the time.
Precisely. It evaluates the deeper qualities of democratic and autocratic authority. It uses a scale from -10, which represents a strongly autocratic closed regime, to +10, which is a fully institutionalized, stable, liberal democracy.
Got it. So -10 to +10.
Right. And to get that score, they measure the competitiveness of political participation. They look closely at the constraints placed on the chief executive.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning, can the leader just wake up on a Tuesday and change the law by decree, or do they have to fight through a legislature and an independent judiciary?
Checks and balances.
Yes. They also measure how open and transparent the executive recruitment process is. How do people get into power?
So it's really a measurement of structural predictability.
Exactly.
Okay, so I am looking at the long-term trajectory for Australia on this metric, on this chart. And it is a perfectly flat, boring, unbroken horizontal line sitting at the absolute maximum score of +10.
Flat as a pancake.
From 1946 to the present day, the line does not twitch. It's almost eerily calm.
But that flat line is the ultimate goal of institutional development. It represents decades of predictable transitions of power. Prime ministers come and go, parties swap control of the parliament, massive policy debates happen regarding taxes or foreign policy.
But the rules don't change.
The underlying rules of how those debates are settled never, ever change. The bedrock is completely stable.
Okay, so contrast that flat, calm line with Argentina. Because if Australia's bedrock, looking at this chart, Argentina is a jagged heart monitor during a medical emergency.
It's a very chaotic visual.
The data swings violently between positive democratic values and deep negative autocratic values. And there's this one specific point. You have this massive, terrifying plunge, specifically in 1976. There's a giant red arrow in the report pointing to it. The data just falls off a cliff into deep autocratic territory.
Yeah, the 1976 military coup in Argentina is the most stark example of this volatility. It ushered in a brutal dictatorship and a profound rupture in their political institutions.
But it's not just that one coup, is it?
No, the key takeaway from the data isn't just that isolated event. It's the chronic volatility surrounding it. You see a pattern of military interventions, constitutional crises, and civilian governments being either overthrown or severely undermined.
So the rules of the game are constantly being ripped up and rewritten.
Constantly.
And then we bring Armenia into the picture. Now, Armenia's data doesn't even exist on this tracking system until 1992.
Right, because prior to that, it was subsumed within the Soviet Union. It wasn't an independent data point.
Right. Right. So when it does appear in 92, it starts deep in negative authoritarian territory. And the trajectory shows this grueling, arduous, really steep crawl upward. They are clawing their way toward a mixed, more democratic regime step by painful step.
It visually represents a state attempting to construct an entirely new political identity and institutional framework while simultaneously managing the fallout of total economic collapse.
It's a slow, highly vulnerable climb.
Very vulnerable.
I want to pause here for a second and maybe challenge this premise a bit.
Sure.
Because if I am listening to this, and maybe I have a business background or an entrepreneurial mindset, I might look at a totally flat line like Australia's and think, well, that looks stagnant.
Okay, I see where you're going.
Right. In the business world, we idolize disruption. We say you need to break things to innovate. Doesn't a political system occasionally need a massive shock, like a complete clearing out of the old bureaucracy, to make way for better, more modern policies? Why is political disruption inherently viewed as a negative in this data?
It is a brilliant question because it highlights the exact danger of applying corporate philosophy to sovereign nations.
That's how.
A nation-state is not a tech startup in a garage. If a tech startup fails because its disruption strategy went wrong, what happens? The investors lose some venture capital. They write it off.
Right.
If a nation-state's fundamental institutions fail, millions of people lose their life savings, their healthcare access, their physical security, and frankly, their future. The scale of consequence is entirely different.
Okay, let's flesh out a mechanical analogy for this to really make it visual. The report kind of suggests this idea. Australia, with its flat line at a score of +10, is a house built on solid bedrock.
I like that.
When you have an election in Australia and change policies, you are essentially renovating the kitchen or maybe painting the living room. You might knock down an interior wall to open up the space. That's a normal political debate. But the foundation of the house never, ever moves.
Continuing that logic, Argentina is a magnificent, sprawling, incredibly expensive mansion. But it has been constructed directly on top of an active tectonic fault line.
Oh, wow.
You can install the most beautiful marble countertops in the world, and those represent periods of great economic policy or agricultural booms in Argentina. But if the fault line slips,
The entire structure cracks.
the structure cracks, the plumbing breaks, and the house becomes literally uninhabitable until you rebuild it from the ground up.
And Armenia, in this analogy, is a house being constructed from scratch, brick, by a family standing in a freezing field immediately following a magnitude 9.0 earthquake.
That perfectly captures the dynamic of all three. And it leads us to arguably the most vital concept in this entire analysis, the stability premium.
The stability premium.
So when a nation secures a predictable, unwavering institutional foundation, that bedrock, it unlocks the ability to generate compound interest. But we aren't talking about compound interest in a bank account.
No.
We are talking about compound interest applied to the society itself.
Compound interest in policy. That's a fascinating way to frame it. Walk me through the actual mechanics of that. How does a policy compound over time?
Well, think about the massive necessary investments that actually build a wealthy nation. Building a national highway system takes, what, 15 years?
At least.
Constructing a high-speed broadband network across a continent takes a decade. Revamping a national education curriculum to focus on STEM fields takes 20 years before those 5-year-old children finally graduate from university and enter the workforce as engineers.
Right, those are all multi-generational projects. They completely outlast any single politician's term in office.
Precisely. When institutions are stable, a massive infrastructure or education policy implemented in 1960 pays its first dividends in 1980. The society is wealthier, it's more connected, it's more educated.
And then what do they do with that new wealth?
They take that new wealth and reinvest it in the 1980s, creating even more advanced policies that pay out in 2000. The progress compounds. Investors, both domestic and foreign, trust the system. They're willing to lock up their billions of dollars for 30 years because they know the government isn't going to seize their assets or arbitrarily change the rule of law next Tuesday.
But when you live on a fault line, when you have the historical volatility of Argentina, the disruption doesn't just clear out bad policies. It resets the entire societal clock.
Every time there's a regime change, a military intervention, or a severe constitutional crisis, Those 20-year projects are completely abandoned.
Because the new guy wants nothing to do with the old guy's project.
Exactly. The new government halts the construction of the power plant simply because it was the old government's idea. Capital instantly flees the country because the risk is unquantifiable.
Yeah,
You cannot model the risk of a military coup on an Excel spreadsheet.
you just can't.
Furthermore, your human capital, your most talented doctors, scientists, and engineers, they emigrate to places with bedrock. So the compound interest stops accumulating, the dividends vanish, and the nation is forced to start over from zero decade after decade. You forfeit the stability premium.
The terrifying conclusion there is that a thoroughly mediocre economic policy, if it's just executed consistently without interruption for 50 years, will mathematically outperform a brilliant, revolutionary economic policy that gets ripped up and reversed every 4 years.
The historical data absolutely supports that conclusion, 100%. Predictability is the oxygen that allows complex, modern economies to breathe, to plan, and to grow. Volatility just suffocates long-term planning.
If predictability is oxygen, let's look at what happens when a country suffocates. Because when we examine the macroeconomic performance data in the report, we hit the paradox of growth.
This is where it gets very real for the average citizen.
Right, this is where the long-term consequences of those political tectonic plates become undeniably physically visible in daily life.
The contrast in the GDP trajectories here is staggering. The report has a composite analysis of overall GDP growth and GDP per capita over the decades.
And again, Australia is our baseline. Looking at their chart, it is a smooth, predictable, upward-sloping mountain. It just marches steadily up and to the right decade after decade, obviously weathering global recessions, but always returning to that compound growth.
Steady as she goes.
But Armenia's economic chart, it is visually shocking. It presents this massive, violent V shape.
The left side of that V shape is the period between 1992 and 1994. The data records an extreme, virtually unprecedented economic contraction for a country that isn't actively being carpet-bombed. Armenia lost over 50% of its entire economy in roughly 36 months.
I really want you to stop and process the reality of that number, losing 50% of your economy in 3 years.
It's hard to fathom.
It is. In developed nations, when the stock market drops 5% or unemployment ticks up by just 2 points, it completely dominates the news cycle. Politicians lose their jobs and people panic. Imagine half of all economic activity in your entire country just vanishing.
The mechanics of that collapse are deeply rooted in their previous reliance on the Soviet system. An Armenian factory, for example, might have produced copper wiring, right, but it relied on machinery from Ukraine, rubber from Belarus, and electricity coordinated all the way from Moscow.
Everything was integrated.
Highly integrated.
Yes.
So when the Soviet Union dissolved, the borders closed, the supply chains were severed instantly, the factory physically could not operate. Add to that a severe regional conflict and a total energy blockade, and you have a total systemic failure. The currency became essentially worthless paper.
But the twist in the data, the reason this report focuses so heavily on Armenia, is the right side of that V shape, the rebound. The chart shows that after that terrifying plunge into the abyss, Armenia experiences this incredible, explosive growth trajectory.
The catch-up phase.
Yeah. In fact, as we move into the early 21st century, the data shows Armenia's economic growth rate repeatedly and significantly surpassing Argentina's.
This is a critical phenomenon in development economics. It demonstrates the sheer explosive power of a transition country once it manages to find a stable institutional footing, however fragile that footing might initially be.
Even if they're starting from the bottom.
Right. When a country like Armenia stabilizes its baseline, even at a very low level of overall wealth, the potential for rapid catch-up growth is immense.
How does that catch-up actually work mechanically, though? Why can they grow faster than a developed country? Like, why does their line point up sharper than Australia's?
Because they don't have to invent the wheel. A highly developed country like Australia is operating at the technological frontier. For them to grow, they literally have to invent new technologies or find entirely new efficiencies, which is slow and incredibly expensive.
It takes R&D.
Exactly. Can simply adopt existing global technologies. They can integrate into modern trade networks and rapidly reallocate their labor force from, say, inefficient surviving state enterprises to new, highly productive private businesses. They can leapfrog entire stages of historical development.
Well, Argentina, a country that had a massive century-long head start and vastly more natural resources, is just stalling out on the chart. They are barely treading water.
Because while Armenia is capitalizing on its newly forming institutional stability to drive that catch-up growth, Argentina is being suffocated by its political volatility.
Yeah.
The fault line keeps slipping.
And there is no better, more visceral visual representation of that economic suffocation than the inflation data in this report.
Oh, the inflation heat map is incredible.
It's wild. So I am looking at this heat map tracking inflation rates, specifically comparing Australia and Argentina. For Australia, the inflation is represented by these tiny, polite little bars just hovering near the bottom of the axis. They barely register. They look like small ripples on a calm pond.
Which is exactly what a heavily managed, predictable monetary environment looks like under the control of an independent central bank.
But right next to it is the data for Argentina. The inflation bars for Argentina don't just go up, they violently explode off the top of the chart. The researchers literally had to break the y-axis to fit the data onto the page.
It's true, the visual scale is broken.
We are talking about periods of hyperinflation that are almost unfathomable to someone living in a stable democracy. Inflation rates in the thousands of percent during their worst historical crises.
It's the defining agony of the Argentine economic experience over the last half-century. It destroys savings, it destroys business planning, it destroys the basic utility of money itself.
But I want to push back on the interpretation here.
Go for it.
Because when I read the news and see a headline about inflation, my instinct is to think, okay, the central bank made a mistake, the finance minister miscalculated the money supply, they printed too much currency. It feels like a mathematical error, like a technocratic mistake. Why is a chart about inflation serving as the centerpiece of a report about political institutional resilience?
Because treating chronic triple-digit hyperinflation as a simple math error is fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of the disease.
Okay, unpack that for me.
The researchers explicitly connect this staggering inflation data directly back to the political volatility we discussed regarding the 1976 coup and the continuous regime changes. Uncontrollable currency is not a mathematical miscalculation. It is the most direct, devastating manifestation of a total political failure.
I really need you to connect those dots for me. How does political instability force a country to physically turn on the printing presses? What is the day-to-day mechanism?
Think about the daily reality of a government operating without bedrock consensus. You have a deeply fractured society. You have powerful competing factions. You've got massive labor unions, influential provincial governors, entrenched military factions, wealthy business elites.
Right. Lots of special interests.
And none of them agree on the rules of the game. So what does a fragile, vulnerable government do to maintain the peace, to avoid a general strike, or simply to survive the month without being overthrown by one of those factions?
They have to hand out favor. They have to essentially buy loyalty.
Exactly. They promise massive wage increases to the unions. They promise massive subsidies to the provincial governors to keep them quiet. They promise lucrative contracts to the business elites.
But I'm guessing they don't actually have the money?
Exactly. The government doesn't actually have the tax revenue to pay for all these promises. The economy is stagnant because of the volatility, and tax evasion is rampant because nobody trusts the state anyway.
So they have a massive gap between the political promises they are forced to make just to survive and the actual cash sitting in the treasury.
Right. And how do you bridge that massive gap when you can't borrow money internationally because you've defaulted on your sovereign debt in the past?
You pick up the phone.
You pick up the phone, you call the central bank, which is crucially not independent in this scenario, and you order them to turn on the printing presses. You monetize the political deficit.
The printing press isn't an economic tool, it's a political survival mechanism.
It is the ultimate release valve for a society that cannot mediate its conflicts through stable democratic institutions. When institutions are weak, inflation becomes an invisible tax levied on the entire population.
And it usually hurts the poorest the most, right?
Always. It hurts the poorest to pay for the inability of the political class to reach a consensus. The inflation chart is just the economic symptom. The political fault line is the actual disease. And the beta projections in this report, looking past the year 2020 and into 2025, show Argentina locked in this high-risk volatility. The underlying political dynamics, the lack of consensus, they haven't been resolved.
This raises a massive question for me. If the currency is chronically broken, if the economy is swinging wildly from crisis to crisis, and your savings are being wiped out by hyperinflation every decade, how do the actual citizens survive?
It's a miracle of endurance, honestly.
I mean, why hasn't society completely disintegrated? If I'm imagining my own bank account losing 80% of its purchasing power in a single year, I imagine pure anarchy in the streets. How is Argentina still a functioning modern society with cafes and universities and hospitals?
That leads us to a really incredibly nuanced section of the analysis, exploring what the researchers call the human development shield. Because the relationship between macroeconomic chaos and individual human suffering is far more complex than a straight line.
To understand the shield, we have to look at the Human Development Index, or the HDI. For you listening who might only track GDP, can we unpack what the HDI actually measures? Because it's not just about money, is it?
No, not at all. The HDI was created by the United Nations, specifically to counter our global obsession with GDP. It is a composite summary measure of average achievement in key dimensions of human development.
So what are the pillars?
It looks at three main pillars: a long and healthy life, which is measured by life expectancy at birth; being knowledgeable, which is measured by expected and mean years of schooling; and having a decent standard of living, measured by gross national income per capita.
It's kind of the ultimate race for societal well-being.
Ex-
So we track the trajectories of our three nations on this HDI scatter plot. Australia is sitting firmly, predictably, in the very high tier. It hovers comfortably above the zero 0.9 mark on the index.
Which is exactly what you expect for a stable, high-income, liberal democracy with universal healthcare and excellent public education. No surprises there.
Right. And Armenia displays that remarkable agility again. After the devastating crash in the early 90s, the data shows their HDI trajectory rapidly sprinting upward, crossing the zero 0.7 threshold after the year 2000.
A very strong recovery.
But the real paradox here, and honestly the data point that genuinely blew my mind when I read this, is Argentina. Despite all the economic chaos, the hyperinflation, the history of military coups, the sovereign debt defaults, Argentina's HDI remains remarkably high.
It's shockingly resilient.
It sits far higher than you would intuitively expect for a country with an exploding inflation chart. How is that mechanically possible?
This is one of the most profound insights in the entire deep dive. The researchers identify this as the lag effect of institutional legacy. You see, an economic collapse, like a currency crisis, a sudden spike in inflation, a sovereign default, that can happen literally overnight. A finance minister makes an announcement on a Friday, and by Monday, your savings are decimated.
Right.
But an economic collapse doesn't immediately wipe out a population's education.
Right. Like if my money becomes worthless today, I don't forget how to read tomorrow.
Precisely. The hyperinflation doesn't instantly cause the concrete in the hospitals to crumble. It doesn't erase the engineering knowledge in the minds of the workforce. What you are seeing in Argentina's persistently high HDI is a nation coasting on the massive visionary investments in public health and universal high-quality education that were made in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Ah, back when they were the global powerhouse. Back when they were building the European architecture and exporting beef to the world.
Exactly. During their golden era, they built a robust, highly educated middle class. They built a sophisticated cultural and intellectual infrastructure. And that profound historical foundation acts as a societal shock absorber.
It acts as a shield.
Yes, a shield. Even when the macroeconomic numbers look absolutely apocalyptic, the average citizen is still highly literate, still has access to legacy healthcare systems, and still operates with middle-class societal norms. The shield protects the population from the absolute worst base-level effects of the economic volatility.
But the report attaches a severe warning label to this phenomenon, right? It's not a permanent state of grace.
No, it is highly finite. The analysts describe Argentina's HDI trajectory as a decaying orbit.
Oh, that's a chilling phrase.
Think of a satellite that has lost its thrusters. It's still high above the Earth, it looks fine from a distance, but gravity is slowly, inevitably pulling it down.
Because it's not generating its own upward momentum anymore.
Exactly. You can only live off the legacy infrastructure of your grandparents for so long without massive reinvestment. If constant economic volatility prevents you from building new state-of-the-art hospitals, updating your university research labs, or maintaining the physical power grid, eventually that early 20th century capital will depreciate to zero. The shield is strong, it has lasted a long time, but it is slowly cracking under the pressure.
A decaying orbit. That is a haunting way to visualize a nation's trajectory. Now let's contrast that decaying orbit with the brutal reality of Armenia's rebirth. Because the researchers provide this intense dashboard infographic looking at the extreme material deprivation during the period from 1992 to 2000.
The data from those initial years of independence is incredibly sobering. We are looking at metrics of absolute poverty, lack of basic heating, lack of reliable food supply.
I really want you to put yourself in this scenario for a moment. Imagine your entire reality, the state that provided your job, guaranteed your pension, subsidized your daily bread, and managed the heating fuel for your apartment building. Imagine that state simply evaporates overnight. It ceases to exist.
It's almost unimaginable for us.
The data here shows a population suddenly plunged into the dark. You are tasked with building a modern state welfare system, a tax code, a central bank, a military from absolute zero while actively fighting a war for survival.
It requires an almost unimaginable level of societal resilience and solidarity. The nascent Armenian state had to figure out how to extract tax revenue from a formal economy that had completely collapsed into a barter system, just to pay for the most basic services.
But the data trajectory shows they did it. It wasn't magic and it wasn't instant. But slowly, agonizingly, as the 1990s end and the 2000s approach, the extreme poverty indicators begin to tick downward. The HDI begins its steep climb.
And that provides a crucial analytical takeaway regarding institutional development. Armenia's experience proves that hitting absolute rock bottom can actually serve as the ultimate foundation for a nation, provided one single non-negotiable condition is met.
What's the condition?
The directional vector of the new institutions must be correct.
The directional vector.
Yes, if the society fundamentally agrees on the basic rules of the game moving forward, that they want a market economy, that they are aiming for democratic norms, that they value education, even if they are desperately freezing poor in the moment, they can build upward.
Because everyone is pulling in the same direction.
Exactly. The compound interest starts accumulating from a baseline of zero. The profound tragedy is when you have immense wealth and a head start, like Argentina, but the directional vector keeps reversing and the fault line keeps slipping.
Okay, so if a nation establishes the right directional vector, what slows them down? What makes the climb harder than it needs to be? That brings us to the next layer of this analysis, focusing on the invisible red lines of governance quality. We are talking about the daily friction between the citizen and the state.
This is a critical pivot in the data. We are moving away from grand macroeconomics, inflation, and GDP and looking at how the state actually administers its power on a Tuesday morning. We are examining the rule of law index against the corruption index provided by VDEM.
Right, this is a radar chart in the report. And when we plot these indices on the graph, Australia, predictably, represents the geometric ideal of institutional trust. It is a nearly perfect circle. It's balanced, clean, and highly predictable. The rule of law is absolute, and corruption is statistically negligible.
It means the rules apply equally to everyone, and the bureaucracy functions as designed, rather than as a toll booth.
But when we look at the data for Argentina and Armenia, the visual representation becomes highly irregular, jagged, and distorted. And the researchers specifically highlight that both of these nations, despite their very different trajectories, suffer significantly in the realm of administrative corruption.
It is vital that we define what we mean by corruption in this specific developmental context. We aren't necessarily just talking about a cartoonish dictator stealing billions of dollars and hiding it in a numbered Swiss bank account.
Though grand corruption certainly exists.
It does, but we are focusing on administrative or petty corruption.
Okay, to make this real for you listening, imagine trying to open a small coffee shop in your neighborhood. In Australia, you fill out the forms online, pay a standardized fee, the health inspector comes, checks boxes based on a public code, and you open. The process is clean, boring, and predictable.
Now imagine trying to open that same coffee shop in a system plagued by administrative corruption. Before you can even sign the lease, you have to pay a bribe to the local zoning clerk to process the paperwork. Then you have to pay an unofficial fee to the fire inspector so he doesn't arbitrarily fail your building. Then you have to pay the local police just to ensure they respond if you're robbed.
So administrative corruption is just pure friction. It is sand poured directly into the gears of the economy.
Exactly. It operates as a highly regressive, completely unpredictable tax on ambition. If an entrepreneur faces a gauntlet of unofficial tolls just to operate, it stifles innovation. It forces businesses to stay small to avoid attention, or it drives economic activity entirely underground into the shadow economy.
Which means the state collects no taxes from them to build the roads or schools.
Exactly. And the data highlights a specific fascinating cluster for Argentina. It shows a continuous marked decline in governance quality and a rise in this friction specifically throughout the 1990s.
Which perfectly aligns with the macroeconomic volatility we unpacked earlier.
It is a vicious cycle. When the formal rules of a society are constantly changing due to political instability, or when the formal rules simply aren't enforced, Informal rules take over to fill the void. Nepotism, bribery, and backroom deals become the only reliable way to get things done.
It's basically survival logic. If you can't trust the bedrock, you trust the bribe.
Yes, beautifully said. And while Armenia is making great strides in human development, the data shows this administrative friction remains a persistent headwind they have to constantly fight against to maintain their catch-up growth.
But buried right next to this rather bleak analysis of corruption is a data point that provided my absolute favorite aha moment of this entire deep dive.
Oh, the gender equality data.
Yes. The researchers identify what they call the hidden growth engine. They track gender equality across all three nations over time using a stacked bar chart.
Utilizing the VDEM Gender Equality Index, which is great because it tracks not just legal rights on paper, but actual participation in the economy and education.
Now, the baseline is positive globally. All three nations show a long-term rising trend in gender equality. But there is a massive surprise discovery hidden in the timelines. The data reveals distinct, specific periods where the growth rate of female education and female workforce participation in Armenia actually outpaces the growth rate of those same metrics in Australia.
That is a staggering statistic if you think about the relative wealth of the two nations during those periods.
My immediate question when I saw that was, why? Why does a country literally struggling to rebuild its power grid from the rubble suddenly start accelerating female education faster than a wealthy, incredibly stable, liberal democracy?
The analysts describe this as the catch-up effect of late developing states. But the driving mechanism isn't just progressive social theory taking hold. No, the driving mechanism is pure, brutal, existential necessity.
Okay, explain that necessity. Put us back in Armenia in the 1990s.
Consider their strategic reality. You are a small, landlocked nation. You are blockaded by hostile neighbors. Your Soviet-era heavy industry, which traditionally relied on male physical labor, is completely dead.
Right.
And crucially, many of your working-age men are either mobilized for regional conflict or have emigrated to Russia or the West to send back remittances. So if you want to survive as a sovereign nation, you mathematically cannot afford to leave 50% of your cognitive capacity sitting on the sidelines.
It is an absolute all-hands-on-deck emergency.
Precisely. For a transitioning country to survive, stabilize, and rapidly modernize, it absolutely must mobilize its female population into the highly educated workforce. In Australia, gender equality evolved alongside steady, comfortable economic growth, driven by decades of vital social movements and gradual policy shifts. It was a moral arc.
But in a post-collapse transition state like Armenia,
Achieving rapid gender equality in university enrollment and the tech workforce is an acceleration driven by survival. It becomes the most accessible, high-yield lever the state possesses to immediately boost human capital and economic output.
that really reframes the entire concept. It frames equality not just as a moral imperative, which it undeniably is, but as a hard-nosed, unavoidable macroeconomic strategy for national survival. You cannot cross the chasm of development hopping on one leg. You need your entire population educated and mobilized.
And the data proves that when necessity forces that mobilization, the societal returns are explosive.
So we've seen how these nations survive, how they struggle with corruption, and how they mobilize their populations. But what is the actual physical cost of this progress? Let's look at the hard metrics of life: health, education, and the ecological price tag of development.
We must start with the most fundamental, undeniable metric of human progress. How long do people actually get to live on this planet?
The researchers map out World Health Organization life expectancy data over the decades using a step chart. Australia, as our anchor, maintains a long-term comfortable lead. Australians live a very, very long time. But the fascinating part is that the gap is actively closing. Post-2015, the data shows both Argentina and Armenia solidly entering the 75-plus years tier.
Which, zooming out to a global historical perspective, is a monumental achievement for human development.
It really is. But the report specifically isolates the massive jump Armenia made, marked with this big green arrow. If you look at the valley they fell into during the 1992 collapse, their life expectancy took a severe, measurable hit. The stress of war, the lack of basic medicine, the total collapse of the Soviet healthcare apparatus, people died younger.
It was a very dark period.
But the climb out of that valley is incredibly steep. They added years to their average national lifespan in a remarkably compressed time frame. How do you engineer a jump like that?
It speaks to the incredible efficiency of modern, basic public health interventions once a state manages to establish even baseline stability. You don't need a trillion-dollar economy to see massive gains in life expectancy.
Really? Just the basics work.
Absolutely. If a recovering state can manage to reliably deploy basic childhood vaccines, improve municipal sanitation and clean water access, and provide fundamental maternal care, the statistical yield in life expectancy is massive. It's the low-hanging fruit of institutional recovery.
Okay, moving from health to human capital, the researchers map out education using this really complex bubble chart. They're plotting education expenditure against secondary school enrollment, with the size of the bubble representing the actual quality of the human capital being produced.
They are essentially trying to quantify the principle that knowledge is power.
Right. And in this visualization, Australia is just a massive, stable, giant presence. They have a huge reservoir of high-quality human capital, predictably funded year after year. But Armenia's trajectory is fascinating. The percentage of their GDP that they invest in education fluctuates wildly. It bounces up and down based on whatever economic crisis or border issue they're facing that year.
Which is typical for a transition state.
But despite the erratic funding, the overall trend is upward, and the measurable quality of the education keeps growing.
This specific data point proves a vital corollary to the concept of institutional resilience. It demonstrates that the accumulation of knowledge can actually survive economic volatility if the cultural foundation is strong enough.
How so? Because usually less money means worse outcomes, right?
Think about the lag effect we discussed with Argentina, but applied dynamically here. A sudden currency crisis in Armenia might mean the government has to delay building a new state-of-the-art high school. The physical infrastructure suffers.
The building doesn't get built.
Right. But that currency crisis does not erase the advanced calculus skills of the students sitting in the old building. It doesn't erase the cultural reverence for education that parents instill in their children. If the cultural commitment to education remains an unshakable institution itself, which it historically is in Armenia, then human capital continues to compound, even when the GDP chart looks like a jagged saw blade.
That's amazing. The knowledge compounds even when the money doesn't. But then the researchers throw a massive, provocative twist into the narrative. We have been holding up Australia as the perfect, flawless model of development, the bedrock. But the data analysis pivots to measure the ecological footprint of these nations using a waterfall chart.
And this is exactly where the Australian model exposes its most severe vulnerability.
The data reveals a staggering ecological price tag. Australia looks absolutely perfect on paper for wealth, stability, and human development. But that development is currently fueled by an incredibly high per capita consumption of natural resources and massive carbon emissions. They are operating at a severe ecological deficit, consuming vastly more than their landmass can regenerate.
While Armenia, conversely, maintains a relatively low ecological pressure on the chart, despite their rapidly rising human development.
Let me offer an analogy to visualize this contrast. The data suggests that Australia is driving a beautifully engineered, incredibly safe, luxuriously comfortable vehicle down the highway of development, but it is a massive, heavy, gas-guzzling machine that requires an immense amount of fuel to keep moving forward.
Right.
Armenia, on the other hand, because of its economic collapse and severe poverty in the 90s, was essentially forced to ride a bicycle. They couldn't afford the gas guzzler. But because they were forced onto the bicycle, the data implies that Armenia accidentally stumbled into a low-carbon transition model.
That is a very potent analogy. And it strikes at the heart of one of the most fiercely debated questions in modern development economics.
Which is?
Do transitioning or developing nations absolutely have to follow the Australian model? Is it a mandatory requirement of human progress that a nation must pass through a hyperconsumptive, environmentally destructive, heavy industrial phase to reach a high standard of living?
Or is there a way to leapfrog that dirty phase entirely?
That is the trillion-dollar question. Because Armenia had its heavy, highly polluting Soviet industrial base completely wiped out in the 1990s, their economic recovery could not rely on smokestacks. They were forced to build an economy driven by services, light manufacturing, and increasingly, technology. They are achieving high human development with a fraction of the ecological footprint of the developed world.
But I have to play devil's advocate here. Is that an intentional, replicable model for other nations, or is it just an accident of history? Like, are they green by design or green by poverty?
That is exactly the debate the analysts raise in the report. It is undeniably an accident of history initially. But the result is that they are now positioned in the 21st century with an economy geared toward the future, rather than an economy anchored to heavy carbon extraction. The challenge for them is maintaining that low footprint as they become wealthier.
Which transitions us perfectly to the final major lever of development in the data, the digital pivot. Because if you are going to leapfrog the industrial age, you have to land squarely in the digital age.
The data on digitalization provides the final, essential piece of the puzzle for understanding how transitioning nations attempt to cross the chasm today.
The researchers track internet penetration rates from the year 2000 to 2020, and the visual difference in the growth curves is striking. Armenia achieves an absolute exponential leap. They go from near zero connectivity to highly saturated penetration in the blink of an eye historically. Now, the report is clear that Australia still completely dominates in terms of raw, multi-billion-dollar R&D spending. But Armenia closes the basic, vital connectivity gap with astonishing speed.
What's truly fascinating here is the underlying mechanism driving that speed. We have to return to geopolitics for a second. For a landlocked country, surrounded by complex and sometimes hostile borders, digitalization isn't just a trendy economic sector they want to develop to boost GDP. It is the single, solitary lever available to them to bypass their geographic reality.
I love the phrase you used earlier when we were reviewing the notes. He said, the internet is their ocean.
It's the only way to conceptualize it. If your physical borders are closed, you cannot export heavy manufactured goods. You can't put tractors on a train if the train tracks are blocked. So what do you export? You export code. You export software architecture. You integrate your workforce into the global digital service economy where physical geography, blockades, and landlocked borders simply cease to matter.
You build fiber optic cables instead of shipping ports.
Exactly. The rapid obsessive digitalization of Armenia is a perfect example of institutional adaptation to severe existential geographic constraints. They found the one door that wasn't locked, and they poured all their human capital through it.
So, synthesizing all of this data, the political bedrock, the inflation disease, the human development shield, the gender mobilization, the digital pivot, the researchers moved to the most difficult part of the analysis. They forecast. Based on trend projections from 2021 through 2025, what does the data say is actually coming for these three nations?
The predictive models are stark, and they beautifully summarize the consequences of everything we've discussed so far.
Let's start with Argentina. What is their trajectory?
The models show flashing warning signs. They are projected to remain trapped in what economists call the middle-income trap. This is a deeply frustrating state characterized by low overall growth combined with high, persistent volatility. They are wealthy enough not to be desperately poor, but too unstable to break through to advance high-income status.
So they're just stuck.
Unless they find a way to forge a completely new, foundational political consensus and repair their institutional bedrock, the data suggests they are locked in a continuous, chaotic cycle of boom and bust.
The fault line keeps slipping. And what about Armenia?
Armenia is projected as the archetype of a smooth, upward-trending transition state. They have unequivocally found the correct directional vector. The massive caveat, of course, is external security. But assuming they can navigate their geopolitical challenges, their internal institutional mechanics are now geared for sustained, rapid catch-up growth. The compound interest is working in their favor.
And finally, our baseline, Australia.
Australia remains the anchor. They are the model of sustained, institutionalized prosperity. They absolutely face modern challenges, like mitigating the ecological footprint we discussed. But their institutional machinery, that bedrock of positive 10, is perfectly equipped to debate, process, and implement solutions to those challenges over the long term without the system breaking down.
All right, let's pull all these threads together. We have journeyed through thousands of data points, 3 continents, and 80 years of human history. We set out to find the golden ratio of institutions. How do the researchers distill this massive deep dive down to its essence? Because they offer 3 core, undeniable takeaways based on the historical evidence.
The first takeaway is derived from the Australian baseline. It is the absolute reality of the stability premium. The data proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that institutional consistency provides the ultimate compound interest for national wealth. It is the boring, unsexy, undeniable truth that predictable rules, consistently applied and trusted over decades, are the greatest generator of human prosperity ever invented.
Boring is highly profitable. The second takeaway is the lesson forged in the fire of Armenia. Transition resilience. The Armenian trajectory proves that no matter how catastrophic the collapse, no matter how deep and dark the valley you find yourself in, if the institutional direction is clear, and if you relentlessly invest in human capital, rapid catch-up is mathematically possible. You can construct a modern state from the rubble.
And the third takeaway is the profound tragedy of Argentina. The volatility trap. Argentina's 80-year arc, proves that a lack of foundational political consensus and the constant partisan reversal of policies will inevitably bleed dry even the richest natural endowments on Earth. You can have all the gold, the wheat, the brilliant minds, and the historical head start, but if your institutions are built on a fault line, the wealth will eventually slip through the cracks.
It reminds me of the brilliant visual the researchers use on the final page of their report. They take the visual elements of the three national flags, Argentina, Armenia, and Australia, and they intertwine them into a graphic that perfectly resembles a DNA double helix. It is such a powerful metaphor representing how these wildly diverse, unique paths of national development are ultimately written in the genetic code of their institutions.
If we step back and look at the absolute biggest picture, the fundamental truth revealed by this mountain of data is that institutions are not merely decorative elements of a society. They aren't just the physical buildings where politicians argue in suits. They are the underlying operating system of the nation. Without a stable, functioning operating system, the best hardware in the world, the richest soil, the deepest oil reserves, the smartest citizens will eventually crash.
So, what does this all mean for you, the listener, right now, going about your day? We've spent an hour talking about grand macroeconomics, tectonic political shifts, and sovereign nations. But I want to end by bringing this right down to your individual reality. Think about your own life. Think about your career trajectory, your retirement savings, the physical safety of your family. We, especially those of us fortunate enough to live in stable democracies, have a powerful psychological tendency to attribute our successes entirely to our own hard work. We think it's our own brilliance, our own daily grind, our own hustle that built our lives. But after looking at the wildly divergent, chaotic fates of these three nations, fates driven almost entirely by the invisible rules the citizens were forced to live under, I want you to ask yourself a provocative question. When you look at your life, how much of your personal success is actually your own doing? And how much of it is actually just the invisible scaffolding of your country's institutions doing the heavy lifting for you?